In this video, we're going to be looking at the Baroque era of art. And before we start with the Baroque specifically, we're going to look at the work of the late Renaissance in Venice. The Venetian artists were doing something very different than what the rest of Italian Renaissance painters were doing at the time. Mostly, they were colorist. They didn't rely on drawing as much as what we saw in Florence. The Venetians tended to be colorists, partially maybe because they were using oil paint, which gave them a greater freedom. They were the first folks to use it within the Italian peninsula. They often painted directly on the canvas without any underdrawing. Often they would use glazes as well to build up rich surfaces. They could use it in a way to create volume and the depiction of natural textures. So in this first painting by Titian, the Venus Urbino, this is an oil on canvas in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, Italy. We see several things happening, particularly with this work. From an art design composition perspective, obviously the Venus creates a strong diagonal across the page. Titian has used that green background curtain to highlight her, in particular her face, so that becomes the first focal point typically with this particular canvas. But then the diagonal sweeps us across and then up to the maid and the little girl in the back. That red, of course, then triggers us to look back to the red of the upholstery. So we sort of have this circular motion, if you will, this maybe even an X happening on the page compositionally. Several things that are interesting about this piece. The reason it's called the Venus of Urbino was that this particular work was a gift by the Duke of Urbino to his wife, his young wife, his new wife, in fact. It represents the allegory of marriage, and by its subject of the mythological Venus symbolizes love, beauty, and fertility. The rose in Venus's right hand symbolizing love, the small dog near her feet, marital fidelity, the girl and maid in the background, motherhood. The painting's erotic and sensual in nature was meant to be for a private, domestic purpose, a gift from husband to wife. So this wasn't something that was meant to be publicly seen. It was meant to be placed perhaps in their bedroom, so it would be a very private piece. It was also meant to sort of convey a message to his wife about what was expected of her and her marriage duties. Here's a detail that shows the nature of the paint itself, as we were just chatting with the use of glazes and what you can do with oil paint in particular. And it's not that other Italian artists did not use oil, it's just that the Venetians began using it earlier, and these pieces are very much about paint in a way, and less about the linearity that we saw in much of the other Renaissance work. This next painting is a portrait of Pietro Aretino. What's really striking about this piece is how loose the brushwork is. You can see it's quickly laid down, and yet it really does work well to highlight the richness of the sitter's robe and the details of his face. This next painting is The Rape of Europa, and its work is also very loosely done and kind of a celebration of painting in a way. So the detail that we see here of the angel from one of the tops of the page, you can actually see the brushwork and whatnot as well. So they weren't as concerned with the sort of modeling of the characters, the form. They were concerned very much with color, with sort of the quickness of the brushwork and the spontaneity and the liveliness that one could create with the painting medium that they were using at the time. If we were to compare this particular painting with a piece by Leonardo da Vinci as an example, you can see that this much looser style, as opposed to the very careful, almost drawn painted surfaces that Da Vinci created, which in themselves are really wonderful pieces as well. But here we have a certain freedom in the work, and the color becomes very important, the big areas of color. This painting is by Tintoretto, Domenico Robusta, known as Tintoretto. Furthering the Venetians' unique styles, Tintoretto foreshadowed the Baroque era's use of extreme dark and light. He painted dark backgrounds and then painted with light colors and broad, quick, large brushstrokes without underdrawing. And we can see his work differs in composition with the use of strong diagonals rather than the more formal and serene compositions of Florentine painters. This is Tintoretto's Last Supper painting, and you can see the drama that he's trying to achieve and the sort of light sources that sort of come out of these halos in a way, or even a light source coming from that table. They have sort of an otherworldly kind of quality to them. And I would almost say Tintoretto falls within, I'd say, the Mannerist era as much as the Renaissance. He was certainly a bridge to new and different kinds of work. So the Last Supper scene here has all kinds of fun things in it, aside from, of course, Christ and the disciples. We have, I think, there's a little cat down here trying to get into the, looks like the wine or the food or whatever's happening there. But anyway, it's a very lively piece. Again, it's not very formal. It shows sort of a setting within someone's home, perhaps, which I believe where the Last Supper was actually set. So, and look at the way the angels are done. They're ghost-like up at the top of the canvas on each side. The light itself, the overhead light, has this sort of godlike quality about it. So it's very mythological in a way. So very exciting and fun to look at, but obviously, again, super loose brush work. And the next piece we see is Tintoretto's St. George and the Dragon. Here St. George is slaying the dragon and obviously saving the woman in front, apparently. But also you can see the sort of God representation, again at the top of the canvas, with this magnificent glowing light around the body of the character at the top of the page, the sort of protecting of St. George and obviously the woman in the painting as well. So again, very dramatic and very loose brushwork, a lot to do with color per se, big large areas of color. And again, they did not use much drawing on the canvas to start with and just paint it directly on. The Italian Mannerist style was kind of also a bridge between the Renaissance and the Baroque. Keep in mind that the Reformation had happened, and there was something called the Counter-Reformation happening within the Catholic Church, where they doubled down on some of the criticisms that had been tossed at them that created the split of the churches to begin with during the Reformation. So they became much more dogmatic. They looked to art to actually project and create the power and the glory of the church. We also see monarchs across, particularly Catholic monarchs across Europe, doing something similar, having that sort of using art, if you will, in a propaganda sort of way, as marketing. So here we have, within the Mannerist era, these elongated characters. This is Pontormo's Entombment, also known as a deposition from the cross of Jacopo Pontormo's work. But you can see that it's brightly colored. It is oil and panel. He's using oil paint now at this stage, but the characters are elongated. There's not a lot of value towards showing depth here, just the overlapping of characters. There's also a very circular pattern to this in terms of how we might read this piece. The center, in fact, is someone holding a cloth in her hand, but basically the body of Christ creates this arc, and then up and around there's sort of a circular motion to the composition. But again, it's very well drawn and whatnot, so it's not quite like the Venetian work that we had just seen, but it's very different, of course, than the Renaissance work. It relies less on the chiaroscuro effects of that light and dark shading that we saw in Florentine painting. I'm now going to look at a Spanish painting by El Greco. El Greco, which means the Greek, actually came originally from Crete. His elongated, ghost-like figures speak to a visionary approach to religious art. His work evolved from a more standard Renaissance style to this Mannerist idea that we just talked about. So for instance, in this first piece, Christ Healing the Blind was probably a piece he created when he'd gone to Rome and studied there and set up shop there for a while. But he came from Crete, where he was working and trained in the late Byzantine style. So he travels to Venice first and then later to Rome. And so this earlier work shows more continuity with the Italian Renaissance work, but it still is a little different in its style. The second work, The Burial of Count Orgaz, Now you can start seeing where he's starting to be a little more ephemeral in the quality of the work itself. The characters are more elongated, particularly when we look to the heavens in this particular canvas. It almost is reminiscent in some ways of the Byzantine style that he was trained in. And this last work, The Vision of St. John, you can see how much he has pushed his sort of style. In fact, it's much more related in some ways to Pontormo's work than it is the other Italian Renaissance masters. And even then, it's not very much the same in some ways as Pontormo's work as well. But it's the elongated characters. There's sort of a softness to the whole thing. It's very visionary. As El Greco matured as an artist, he continued to push this sort of concept of the elongation. Interestingly, he influenced a lot of 19th and 20th century artists who look back at his work, only because it was so different for the time that it was created in. If we look a little more carefully at the Burial of Argaz by El Greco, we can see this sort of separation of space. We have the earthly things happening here with the actual burial of the Count, and then above we have this sort of heavenly body, cloud-like, rock-like formation. And then above that, we have even a sort of heaven, if you will. And obviously there's a great deal of symbolism in this piece, everything from the various angels above, even the accoutrements of the people at the base and the things they're doing, and the laying down of the Count, almost as if as we've seen in some of the paintings where the crucifixion and the entombment were taking place, bringing Christ down from the cross. But there's all this sort of sweeping action going on, even though it's a very somewhat symmetrical painting. And now with this artist, Caravaggio, who was painting while the Italian High Renaissance was in full swing. But his work and his style led to many imitators and admirers, and we come to call this style Baroque. It emphasized dramatic themes and focused subject matter with intense light and dark values. It took chiaroscuro to another level, and we call that tenebrism. The composition techniques included more angular shapes and lines, lending a more dramatic look, often with overlapping figures, foreshortened elements, and tightly cropped scenes, creating the illusion that the action is spilling out of the picture plane. This extreme realism created lifelike images emphasizing the human form in action and highly focused storytelling. This is a great piece to look at. It's Medusa, but what's interesting here, it is the act of Medusa being beheaded, so it's a particular moment in time, another significant factor in what typically we see in Baroque work. And Caravaggio was very extreme oftentimes in the way he portrayed things. So it's very illustrative of a particular moment in time. Now, as I mentioned before regarding Mannerism and the sort of change in what was happening in the Catholic Church, many of these methods were a direct result of the Catholic Church's Counter-Reformation mandates, and they're re-embracing visual art as a tool to teach biblical stories in as real and vivid a manner as possible. It was a direct challenge to the Protestant iconoclasts, which would be individuals saying that you can no longer create paintings of Christ, or, painting the common man now is just as important. So it's a direct challenge to what was happening to those churchgoers that had broken away and formed their own churches, those Protestant churches. This art was meant to impress upon followers both the power of God and the church. The style was also embraced by monarchs across Europe. It symbolically portrayed the power of their absolute. This next painting by Caravaggio, Bacchus, is a much more sedate painting, but nonetheless uses one of the most important features of Baroque art, and that's that very intense dark background where the character's coming out. Everything's in the front, as if you could reach out and touch this person. You're invited to be in this painting, and that's really another telling sign of the style of Baroque. This next painting, also by Caravaggio, is Judith beheading Holofernes, another biblical passage, biblical theme, and obviously it shows this action in drama. Here is the moment where the sword is doing its business, and we see the blood. we see the anguish, we see the horror on the face of the victim. We also see the dark background, the fact that it's in our space, if you will. There's no real base to this painting in the sense that the legs are cut off, if you will, but it invites us to be in the painting. So it makes it even more dynamic in that way. This is very much like film in a way, where we have a shot that's very dark and light. The tenebrism, as we just talked about earlier, as we like to call this. And it's very much as if we're in the frame along with the actors. This painting is the Myth of Danae, and it's painted by Orazio Gentileschi. Now, what's interesting about this particular painting, but really his daughter, he apprenticed his daughter, Artemisia Gentileschi, and she became a very well-known painter. It's one of the first women that I will talk about it's one of the first women that we will talk about. And as we go forward, we'll see many more women artists who have become successful, and in many cases were trained by their father or someone, or a relative, someone they knew. Now, Gentileschi was an important artist who I mentioned, apprenticed with her father, Orazio, this being that painting. And then next we see one Artemisia's paintings. This is her painting of Danae, and she did this painting when she was just 19 years old. This painting happens to be at the St. Louis Art Museum, so if you get an opportunity, you can see this piece here in St. Louis. Her subtle rendering of flesh and bold contrast and coloration with spotlight illumination of Danae is very typical of the Baroque era. That's one other thing. Again, they're very theatrical. It's almost like they have theatrical lights pointed directly on their subjects. This is squarely in the Baroque era and plays on Caravaggio's method of pushing chiaroscuro to its extreme to create high contrast and emotionally laden work. Again, think of stage lighting, how it can focus attention on one actor or a group of actors. Here, compositionally, not unlike the Venus of Urbino in many ways, we have this sort of diagonal character across the page, the Venus, if you will, the Danae in this case. The myth is that Danae was impregnated by coins showered, golden coins showered onto her by Zeus. This next painting is also by Artemisia Gentileschi, and it's the same subject, Judas slaying Holofernes, as the Caravaggio painting we just looked at earlier. If we look at these two paintings together, we have Artemisia's to the left and Caravaggio's to the right, and the action of the women in particular is more intense, with Judith being more physical. It's as if she really can do this deed, as opposed to the Judith we see in Caravaggio's piece. She's more physical, and the whole being more believable in its action. And if we look at the composition of these pieces too, you're talking about the psychological line, if you will, but if we look at the figure's arms and the women's eyes, they point to the deed just like an arrow. So it's more powerful in a way than Caravaggio's piece. They're more sort of in the moment, in the action. Again, we have that theatrical light effect by both of these artists to highlight this gruesome act, if you will. And it is a moment in time. This last painting, also by Gentileschi, is the Sleeping Venus. So you can see that this Venus character, Danae-like character also, is a character that is played throughout much of art history, in fact, and was reinvigorated, of course, in the Renaissance and continued to be used throughout the Baroque era, and you'll see this character being used in later eras as well. Now we're going to go to Northern Europe and look at Rembrandt van Rijn's work. Here we see his painting of Abraham and Isaac. He also worked in this Baroque method of light and dark to create very dramatic effects. This is an early piece from 1634. Ultimately, his paintings became looser and looser, with the figures emerging from total darkness. He also was a prolific draftsman and printmaker who created many etchings, and we'll look at one of those pieces as well. Historically, Holland became an important commercial center, and as the artists were not tied to the church, many artists specialized in various genres. So they had broken away, and they became a Protestant majority state in Holland, the Dutch Republic as it was called. Portraiture, landscapes, still lifes, etc. were part of that genre, as well as biblical and mythological themes Obviously, the Abraham and Isaac theme here by Rembrandt was, of course, a biblical theme. This area had become the United Northern Provinces, forming the Dutch Republic in 1581, a Protestant majority region that would become the modern Netherlands. Its principal wealth in banking and trade led to many varied merchant class patrons. So now we're seeing, and this was becoming true, particularly in the Baroque era in Italy as well, but we're seeing commissioned portraits, sort of like the Venus of Urbino. That was a commissioned painting. Here, of course, we have a biblical theme. One of the things that we saw with Rembrandt was that he painted a lot of self-portraits. He was one of the first artists to paint so many self-portraits. Earlier artists would paint themselves into a painting. If you recall Raphael's being painted in the School of Athens, for instance, but those were typically as a minor character. Rembrandt chronicled his life, and in doing so has left us a great study of the evolution of his painting style and technique. As he matured, his work began getting looser and more sure, with the paint becoming as important as the image it created. This is what we often refer to as a painterly style, where the medium becomes as important to the visual experience as the imagery. In some way, the Venetian Renaissance painters like Titian and Tintoretto were obviously doing that as well, where the action of the paint and the quality of the paint surface and the paint itself became part of the excitement of the painting. So here we're seeing a series of his self-portraits and from various years. This next painting is The Night Watch. It's a very large canvas. Historically, it's an important piece in that it has a couple of functions. It shows a particular guild. The guild members within Renaissance and Baroque eras were very powerful in a way. You had like the Gold Guild, the Weavers Guild. There were various groups of people, not unlike unions in a way, but they basically trained people and maintained the craft within this particular guild. In a way, they also controlled the commerce. They were the merchants of that product. They were a cohesive sort of manufacturing operation, if you will. Goldsmiths, watchmakers, gun makers, cloth makers, lace makers. Promotes them purely, they were part of the militia as well, and that's sort of what this highlights, is these characters being part of the militia and going out on the night watch, thus the title. Keep in mind that there were conflicts happening constantly. There was the threat of war all the time. There was the 30 Years' War happening during this era. And so it was important that everyone be part of the militia to protect their country. This is an etching by Rembrandt entitled The Windmill. And he was very prolific at this. In fact, he made pretty good money making the etchings. One of the things about printmaking, as we talked before, is that you can make multiple copies. Having made multiple copies, you can then continue to make more copies if you choose, but you're selling them to many more people. They were much more affordable. We looked at Durer's work earlier. His work was highly traded across Europe, and that was true of Rembrandt's etchings as well. The etching process is, as we talked about before too, is where you take, in this case, he probably used a copper plate. He would put an acid-resist material on it, scratch through that, and then etch those lines into the plate. The ink is then put onto that plate, rubbed into the lines, and then the plate is wiped clean and then printed. The ink then being pulled out of those lines. So basically, it's like reproducing your drawing that they've done on that plate. This next painting is Venus and Adonis by Peter Paul Rubens. Now, Rubens lived next door, literally, to Rembrandt. In the country they called then Flanders. We now think of it as Belgium. So he was a Flemish painter. Flanders was aligned with the Catholic Church. In fact, the whole of the then Netherlands had divided and warred along Protestant Catholic lines, which ultimately divided the country into the current Netherlands, Belgium, which is the former Flanders, and Luxembourg. Rubens' main patron being the Catholic Church, he embraced the Counter-Reformation imagery of bold religious themes and mythological Roman iconography. Rubens' figures included muscular men and fleshy women. His colors were intense. The style of his female nudes was in keeping with the notion of being prosperous. Much of his work includes landscape as background. And I think one of the things we can say, he embraced a bit of the Baroque style, obviously, not to the degree that certain other artists did, but It's almost as if he took the Baroque style and he blended it with the Venetian artist. Because this is looser in the way it's painted. The paint itself becomes an important aspect of it. There's a certain amount of richness of color in this particular piece, and in most Rubens' works as well, that distinguish him from some of the other Baroque paintings. We're now going further south to Spain. Here we're seeing a work by Diego Velázquez. Velázquez very much embraced the Baroque style, but his work also is very painterly. You can see the loose brushwork, particularly in the background of this particular painting. This is a portrait of Juan de Parejo. This is a portrait of Pope Innocent X. Velázquez's work tended to have a very intense style to it, and that was true of much Spanish art then and through many centuries after that as well. We saw some of Goya's work earlier. We'll be looking more intensely at Goya's work later, which would have been perhaps about 100 years after this particular painting. So Velázquez actually became very influential in terms of how he painted and the style of his painting, and of course his keen rendering of these portraits. If we look more closely at some of these pieces, you're going to see the sort of brushwork, not unlike we saw with some of the Venetian painters. So here we sort of have a blend of a more Florentine style because of the realism that he's created here, and the Baroque era, of course, that he falls in. But still, there's a certain energy that he has that some of the other painters don't exhibit. This painting is Los Meninos, sometimes referred to as the Maids of Honor. It's a very curious piece. We actually see the artist to the left here of the canvas. You see he has his palette and his brush, and he's working on a very large canvas. And the mirror in the background, we see the king and queen being reflected. So is Velázquez actually painting the king and queen? This is curious compositionally too, where almost all the action is below, taking up the first third of the painting, and the darkness above shows the room and the details of the ceiling. And of course we see that giant canvas, so it's maybe one of the reasons he actually painted it that way. But it's quite a curious piece, thinking about how one would create this composition too and then paint yourself into it. So he'd have to been in various vantage points at some stage and added characters to the piece as he went along, as he fabricated the painting. Here's a painting by another Spanish painter, Francesco de Zuberan, who obviously also embraced the Baroque concepts, that dark and light, and it's kind of emotional kind of painting as well. This is St. Francis contemplating a skull, and it's here at the St. Louis Art Museum. This work is also known as the Vanitas painting, where we have this concept of life and death, and the inevitable death that will happen for all of us. Some Vanitas paintings also relate to vanity, the concept of vanity, plus the same terminology, the same words being used. Here we see the work of Nicolas Poussin, French painter, entitled The Abduction of the Sabine Women. As you'll notice, it's very different than the other Baroque era pieces we've just been looking at. France remained a Catholic bastion under King Louis XIV, whose preference was for the classical style reborn during the Italian Renaissance. This preference flavored the work of French art at this time. Official art academies were established to foster classical art, reinforcing the style. Further, Poussin was enamored with this style after having seen work by Renaissance masters, and he ultimately traveled to Italy to study and work, living in Rome for many years. His work and other dramatic Baroque paintings and sculpture. Poussin retains sculpted Raphaelesque figures and the strong-weighted pyramid-like composition common in Renaissance work. So in reviewing, here are some of the key points of the Baroque era: dramatic emotional themes, focused subject matter, intense light and dark values, chiaroscuro pushed to the limit known as tenebrism, like theatrical spotlights. Composition techniques included angular shapes and lines. There were often overlapping figures. The appearance of motion and instability, part of this as well. Foreshortened elements and tightly cropped scenes create the illusion that the action is spilling out of the picture plane as if the viewer is in the scene. Extreme realism created lifelike images emphasizing the human form in action and highly focused storytelling. The artist attempted to capture a moment in time.